Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, wherever you may be. I am Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is really my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual policy forum entitled Where Are the Women? Staying Curious About Gender in International Security, hosted in partnership with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, as we all fondly know it. We are at IPI very pleased to co-host this event with UNIDIR, with UNIDIR's Gender and Disarmament Program specifically, as well as our co-sponsors, Canada, Costa Rica, Ireland, Namibia, Norway, the Philippines, and Sweden. So you can see there is great interest and support for this issue. Today's policy forum is part of IPI's Women, Peace, and Security project on realizing the promise of Security Council Resolution 1325, which includes research on women in peace operations and emerging questions related to WPS, as well as research on women's leadership and women's participation in peace processes, all of which are very relevant to today's discussion. This policy forum was designed to explore ways to overcome structural gender inequalities in arms control and disarmament, mediation, and peacekeeping. During this forum, we had the opportunity to discuss the experiences of women across the broad international security field, including to discuss the main barriers they face, as well as existing policies and practices that are advancing inclusivity. Efforts to increase women's participation in international security have received increasing attention in recent years, but we all know that they have had varying degrees of success, to say the least. Recent research indicates that these efforts must be implemented hand in hand with policies that address the challenges facing women's full participation, many of which cut across security subfields from peacekeeping and peace building to disarmament and arms control and beyond. Many of these challenges stem from social and cultural norms of gender that have shaped the security sector institutions. Thus, addressing them requires a shift in organizational cultures in order to promote inclusivity in the security sector. Starting with the question, where are the women, which was initially posed by Cynthia Enloe, this event will gather insights from Professor Enloe herself, as well as from other distinguished panelists working to better understand the multiple roles that women play in international security. After our panel discussion, we should have plenty of time for Q&A. So for those of you in our webinar, I encourage you to use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, to submit your questions for our panelists. Following the Q&A, we will have closing remarks from Dr. Cecil Optel, Deputy Director of UNIDIR. So let me quickly introduce the panel. We have with us today Dr. Cynthia Enloe herself, professor at Clark University, Lieutenant Colonel Lausanne Singamana Ingabere, Gender Advisor, United Nations Office of Military Affairs, Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, fellow with GCSP and former permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva, and Ambassador Don Steinberg, Executive Director, Mobilizing Men as Partners for Women, Peace, and Security, and expert advisor to the Administrator, U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. First, before we turn to the rest of the panelists, we will hear from Cynthia, Dr. Cynthia Enloe. Cynthia, it's been over 30 years since you published your book, Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, which I think we can all agree is one of the greatest titles in the history of security literature. And then nearly 20 years since you published The Curious Feminist. And we are still, we're still asking that question, where are the women in security? Could you share with us how has gender shaped the discourse around security and militarization? And what has changed over the last 20 years and what has not?
Adam, thank you so much. And it's a great honor to be with this wonderfully smart, thoughtful group of panelists. I should say a PS right now that the first time I ever noticed women in the banana industry was when I was trying to make sense of the Costa Rican banana industry. And here's what I learned when I went many years, too many years, all during my graduate work, my first years of teaching, my first years of trying to make any kind of public impact, of not asking where are the women. I just thought it was natural to study men. And so I wrote, I hate to tell you, but I wrote a lot of stuff about security and ethnicity and race around in militaries around the world. And I never noticed I was studying men. So one of the first things that happens when you start asking, I found, and I was late, so there's some embarrassment here. When I started asking where are the women, here's what I noticed. I noticed men. So I had noticed men, but I thought they were just their military rank. I thought they were sergeants, or I thought they were generals, or I thought they were secretaries of defense or ministers of defense, or I thought they were Kikuyu, or I thought they were Luo, or I thought they were Afro Costa Ricans or Mestizo Costa Ricans, or right. I saw them and tried to make to understand by class, race, ethnicity, but not by gender. So here's what I didn't do. I look back on those books that I researched and learned from, and I realized by not asking where women are, I didn't watch the politics of masculinities, plural. Now, Ron, I'm sure will talk more about this, but what this means in the area of security and particularly disarmament is that I didn't realize how masculinized, that's a process of, changing our heads, how masculinized the whole world of security, capital S studies, and security expertise was. I didn't realize the extent to which, if you wanted to be an expert, always in quotes, in security studies, it really helped to wear a tie. It really helped to be seen by other people in the room as a guy. It was really hard if you didn't come across as a certain kind of manly man to be taken seriously in security studies. And it was almost impossible to be taken seriously in security studies or security policy debates if you were seen as a woman. I missed all of that when I didn't ask gender questions. I missed all of that. I really do. That's why I'm kind of evangelical at this point. You have to be curious about women's diverse lives, experiences, and ideas in order to make the politics of masculinity at work in security studies visible. Otherwise, it looks normal in quotes. And when you just leave security studies as normally masculinized, normally left to the manly men, and that doesn't mean a frontline soldier. That means a person who can talk security policy in acceptable manly terms. If you leave that, you'll never change security studies. What that means is that you leave security study, you, I, all of us, and all the 73 participants I can see on the screen, it will mean that everybody will leave as natural, terrible understanding, natural, nothing's natural, and leave it as normal for security studies to be militarized in its manliness. That is, security will never be talked about as women's reproductive rights as adding to women's genuine sense of security. If you leave security without any gender analysis of the workings of masculinity in security expertise and security studies, you will not ask about violence against women. But you also won't ask about childcare. You also won't ask about the political economy of women in agriculture, in factory work, in office work. In other words, we will all leave security unexamined, and that means we'll leave it in a shrunken definition. And that shrunken definition will be militarized and therefore masculinized. Those are yellow flags of warning that I'm hoisting. And I'm hoisting them because it took me so long to wake up to it, to notice that if I didn't take women's lives seriously, women's ideas seriously, women's experiences seriously, I was going to leave security in its very risky form, which is masculinized and militarized. Thanks.
Well, that is so fantastic. I mean, I think that you set up the discussion so well to allow us to understand why we're asking this question, and that it's not just about where the women are, but it's about to understand how gender works in this space, and how, as you say, how masculinized this whole arena is, not just, and frankly, not just security studies, but in the world that we embody and work in here in the National Peace Institute. When you allow the manliness of security to be seen as normal, it's hard to actually get to a discussion of peace. You're really just talking about the militarization of conflict and security, and not actually talking about what sustains peace, what's creates peace, what builds peace, unless you're looking at these broader questions, which I think is one of the things that your curiosity opens the door to. So I really thank you for starting the conversation like this. It's fantastic. We will now turn to Lieutenant Colonel Lausanne Singamana Ingabare, who has a whole host of experience in the field and on the security side. As a former peacekeeper, now working as a gender advisor in the Office of Military Affairs, in your experience, have you seen advances brought by the Women, Peace and Security agenda? And what are the remaining challenges and significant gaps that you see, and how can we chart a path forward? Lausanne, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Adam. First of all, I would like to thank IPI and Unity for this opportunity to be part of such a distinguished and professional panelist. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm still a peacekeeper. I still wear the blue beret. I would say there is a lot of advances brought by the WPS agenda since 2000, since the resolution 1325, mainly regarding the participation of uniformed women in peace operation. And we have noticed an exponential increase of military women deployed from 2016 to now, following to the resolution 1325, the resolution 2242 in 2015, which called for doubling the number of uniformed women peacekeepers. In my opinion, that was a pivotal moment where the curve started to change. The UN system-wide strategy on gender parity launched by the Secretary General also in 2017, I think, and the DPO Uniform Gender Parity Strategy as well were and are still instrumental for the increase of women peacekeeper in peace operation. And when I say women peacekeeper, I mean in uniform. And it also goes hand in hand with fostering and enabling environment for women peacekeepers. The second main advance, in my view, by the WPS agenda is also an increased commitment also from member states to translate or implement the WPS agenda. in strategic framework and national defense action plan in the security sector. This is quite commendable to see that some countries have embraced gender integration and mainstreaming in the security sector to a degree that there remain a need for more comprehensive and systemic reform worldwide. For that, TCC/PCC, I think, need to recognize that women peacekeepers in uniform are also full and equal partner in peace operation. On another dimension of the WPS agenda is prevention and protection. In terms of prevention and protection, I should say that DPO has the last 10 years focused and strengthened efforts to prevent and protect women and children against conflict-related sexual violence through policies, guidance, trainings to militaries, police, and justice and correctional personnel. In terms of, those are the advances. In terms of challenges, maybe, and the gap that need to be addressed, the increase of women of uniform, the women peacekeeper is not the same at all in all categories. For individual position, we are doing quite well. We have reached the targeted set by the DPO uniform gender parity strategy for individual position again. But for women deployed into contingent and units, the actual boots on the ground, we are still lagging, and we are unable to close the gap of women deployed in units. Regarding member states, I just want to flag something here with member states in terms of challenges and gap. With member states, the national security sector processes often address policy and structural aspects and need to address also the culture that underpin the sector from a gender perspective. It's exactly in line with what Professor mentioned before. Various also intersectional challenges are evidence in the recruitment and retention of women in the military and police as well, if I may, and in their deployment in peace operation. The resolution 2538 of last year, I think, and it also the DPO, the Department of Peace Operation, also urges member states to identify and address barrier to recruitment and retention, and also promotion of women in their national military, but also further in their deployment in peace operation. And lastly, I think strengthening and advocacy and lobbying campaign with TCC/PCC to increase women participation can best be affected within enabling framework and policy on gender mainstreaming in peace operation. I would say that is my final note to your question. Thank you.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisanne. I mean, it's good to hear the advances, and it's really encouraging to hear that you are seeing increased member state support, especially in national action plans, which is really, really critical. But of course, I think there's broad recognition about this challenge about boots on the ground, as you say. And I think the research at IPI that Gretchen Baldwin has been doing, who you know, who you speak to here, really is, I think, revealing very strongly this issue of the barriers that we really have to understand. It's not just about the will to increase participation, but also to address those barriers and to provide that enabling framework that you discussed, which I think is really, really good. So thank you. Thank you so much. Now we will move on to Ambassador Elaine White Gomez, a former permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva. Ambassador, you have experience in the disarmament realm in Geneva and such. And how, in your experience, how has the inclusion of women shaped disarmament and arms control outcomes? How can women's participation improve the lived experiences of people around the world in situations of armed violence, conflict, and post-conflict too, as well, I think is important. Ambassador, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would say that there are two trends that we have to consider. The first one is how far we have we have progressed. And by answering your question, one has to, first of all, answer where are the women, see, in this field. And I have to say that, first of all, women are in the field. They are negotiating peace agreements, being community leaders, political leaders. They're just promoting change all over the place, all over the world. When, in my experience, for instance, in the field of nuclear disarmament, when we were needing a paradigm shift, what I can tell you from the negotiations of the Prohibition Treaty on Nuclear Weapons, I can speak of the incredible resilience, strength, courage, leadership of activists, of scholars, delegates, victims, evacuation, trying to move the needle and generate a paradigm shift away from nuclear deterrence and centering the attention on the interest of humanity, on not on the theoretical elaborations of deterrence, but on what exactly it will mean today as to have a nuclear explosion, as also what it meant yesterday in history, what it meant for women, what it meant for indigenous peoples. So there was an outstanding articulation of women leadership in those negotiations. That's for sure, that you all know about that. And also, so there was a very cooperative and problem-solving, creative atmosphere that was part of the reasons. There were many elements why the negotiations were able to being completed in such a record time. There was a very important challenge, but one of the aspects definitely was the women leadership in, as I said, in different stakeholders. Not only the president of the conference, also the representative of the Secretary General, the victims, civil society, academia, and also delegates that were there. So I think, as is the case with the negotiation of the UN Charter, when we saw there were very few women, but the impact was tremendous in actually bringing the Charter for the first time in the world of 1945 to acknowledge the equal rights of men and women. I would say that women are having impact. Actually, if we have a quick visit to the Nobel Peace Awards page, we find that since 1905, there have been several Nobel Peace Awards that have been awarded or received by women for promoting new paradigms of security, of peace, of reconciliation, of peace building, or negotiation on the ground. Names, women, extraordinary women as Alva Myrdal, Betty Williams, Setsu Pothurlo, Beatrice Finn, that received the Nobel in 2017 on behalf of ICANN, for their work on disarmament and the work on promoting this paradigm shift, this disarmament, and to address a completely different vision that takes us away from militarism of war politics and militarism of societal problems. So we see the women, we are here. The other question we have to add to complement to Professor Enlow's question, historic question of where are the women, is what we're doing and what impact we are having. And the related question is how we can build upon that impact that women are having to look for another generation of women, peace, and security agenda. One that, of course, in which we see much more participation, but also one in which we see how we promote, because we have to be careful in this regard. We need to see more women at the room. That is absolutely true. But we cannot put in the shoulders of women delegates who also depend on the instructions they get from their capitals to trigger the paradigm shift that we need at this moment. So we need to find other ways, other means of working with the capitals, with the ministries of defense, the Minister of Security, to see how we incorporate diverse approaches, which mean human security, which means women, peace, and security, which means feminist approach, which means environmental approaches. What we need is to generate, 2020 was, I think, a year that we cannot forget because of the increase of military expenditure when the world was shut down by the pandemic. That is unacceptable. And I think that is a wake-up call that we need to change the militarized approach to everything. Militarized approach to conflict, militarized approach to the use of force overall, and to the moment in which we use force as United Nations, not only expose, but to see how we can engage in ex-ante events so that we don't have to wait until we have to use force. Anyhow, my answer to your question is, the women are here, the women are having tremendous impact, it's being acknowledged. What we have to focus now on is how do we build upon this impact to look at this paradigm shift that addresses the problem of the militarization of world politics and the overall perception of the international community towards conflict.
Fantastic, thank you. That really, and I think that makes a lot of connections going back to what Cynthia opened with. And I should have said at the beginning, you have experience. So you were presiding over many of the negotiations that led to the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And I think this point that was recognized, that there needed to be this paradigm shift to move away from thinking about this issue only in terms of security in the hard sense, but in the broader sense of how nuclear weapons impact society at large. And I think the women's leadership that you point to was really critical to that conversation and that shift. So I really thank you for that. And I think your last point, the note that in 2020, in the height of COVID, military expenditures went up is really striking. What does it mean when any challenge we're confronted with? You say it's a war on COVID, it's a war on this, it's a war on that. What does that structurally do to the kinds of tools that we reach for when we address these challenges? And I think the kind of paradigm shift that Cynthia is discussing and that you're talking about and Lucien is pointed to in the field is really critical for our progress in all of these areas. So really a broadly relevant conversation. Fantastic. So we'll now move to our final speaker on the panel. That is Ambassador Don Steinberg, who is the Executive Director of Mobilizing Men as Partners for Women, Peace, and Security. I'm proud to be one of those partners, as well as his expert advisor at UAID. And I think I'll take this moment to respond to one of our first questions here. Why no woman moderator? In part because I am one of these partners, male partners for Women, Peace, and Security. I'm an advocate and a bit of an evangelist for it myself, Cynthia, but also frankly because the incredible Gretchen Baldwin, my colleague, senior policy analyst who runs this program along with our colleague Phoebe Donnelly, was moderating a session all morning for 3 hours, and so she asked me to come in to help. So. But she's often in the moderator's seat, and we're proud of that at IPI, proud of her work. That whole program is doing fantastic work. So now, Don, Ambassador Steinberg, please tell us. Well, I have a question for you. I got carried away and now I lost my question for you. Yes. Everybody's in our community anyway, we've been all talking about the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda quite a bit. The Secretary General recently identified the gender divide as one of the great divides that the world is experiencing. As Cynthia opened with, the question, where are the women, is a way to open the door to broader gender issues. It's not simply about women, it's about gender more broadly, and men have a very important role in this, both positive and negative. What is the role in your experience that men ought to be playing to help bridge this gender divide? And how can governments, institutions support that moving forward? Ambassador, please, Don, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Adam. This is my first time on the panel at IPI since 2 years ago when we launched the Mobilizing Men as Partners for Women, Peace, and Security at IPI. And to flip the question of the panel, the question that we tried to address that day was not where are the women, but where are the men in the fight for women's empowerment in the WPS agenda? And I am tempted not to make this point, but as I look at the attendees at this program, 85% of the attendees are women, even though this is a key issue on the hard security issues of our times. In fact, during the launch, we had speaker after speaker warn that the rise of armed conflicts, refugee flows, environmental decline, global inequality, and yes, even the threat of pandemic diseases, the world was witnessing the wholesale breakdown of a male-dominated, testosterone-driven global security system. At that time, we argued for an alternative vision for global governance based on 5 principles: international cooperation and coordination instead of a Darwinian survival of the fittest competition, prioritizing human security and socioeconomic well-being over a traditional militaristic and forceful approach to national security, flexible and pragmatic policies based on science, empirical evidence, and long-term perspectives, rather than ideology, public posturing, and national political considerations, diverse, inclusive, and equitable leadership and decision-making, as opposed to the centralized elitist processes that close down civil society space. And finally, for transparency, flexibility, and a willingness to admit mistakes instead of the face-saving and finger-pointing postures that normally prevail. Little did we know that the events of the last 2 years, whether it's the COVID pandemic, Black Lives Matter movement, the explosion of weather-related disasters, would provide such an immediate object lesson of the cost of excluding women. Incidentally, one point we did get right was that excluding women from the negotiations in Afghanistan risks sacrificing the rights of women and the country's future on the altar of a false peace with the Taliban. So moving directly to your question, it's tempting to say that the proper role for men now is to simply step aside and give women the lead in resolving deadly conflict and building just societies. But in truth, global male leaders from the defense, diplomacy, development, and business arena, manly men, as was described earlier, They are still the gatekeepers to the corridors of power, and they have to use their privileged positions to partner with the courageous women leaders who have long driven this agenda, especially grassroots advocates from conflict-affected countries and marginalized populations, recognizing the importance of intersectionality. Men must ally with, listen to, and open doors for women who are fully capable of speaking for themselves and their communities. In the Mobilizing Men as Partners Charter and Statement of Principles, we've identified dozens of time-bound measurable goals tied to desired outcomes and backed by full financing. And I look forward to discussing some of these in greater detail in the Q&A. But most importantly, we need to hold ourselves and our global institutions accountable against 4 metrics. First, are we truly transferring real power and agency to women and other marginalized groups under the principle, nothing about them without them? Second, are we mainstreaming and integrating gender justice into all of our sectoral and regional programs and policies? Third, are we personally stepping forward as global public advocates, spokespersons, and learning institutions in support of women's empowerment in the WPS agenda? And finally, are we walking the walk of women's empowerment within our own institutions through diverse, equitable, and inclusive power structures and human relations and human management systems? If not, then we're simply not serious about our commitment to women's empowerment in this sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. I mean, in particular, your last four priorities are really important. Are we truly transferring real power and agency? There is a lot of tokenism in the system, and we need to be on guard against that. Are we mainstreaming gender justice? Are we personally stepping forward? Something that requires real deep reflection. I think it's not a simple question. And are we walking the walk in our own institutions, in our own spheres of influence? Are we doing what we can do to empower? I think that's really important questions for everybody to ask, both in the gender sphere and in terms of racial justice and marginalized groups of all kinds. Great. I think this has been a really rich panel. We've got a good hour for discussion, so we've got plenty of time. So I do, again, for everybody who is in our in the webinar, please use the Q&A function to insert your questions for the panel. I know that we do have one request that came even before the event for an intervention. Christelle Downing, who is the case study manager at the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict Project at our friends at UNU. Crystal, are you?
Yes, I'm here.
There you go. There she is. Good. Crystal, please. You have a question, comment for the panel, please. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to all of the panelists for really interesting interventions. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about the Managing Exits from Armed Conflict initiative at UN University. Very broadly, we're trying to use research and our project to contribute data and tools to assessments of DDR and other relevant interventions that support individuals and communities in the transition to civilian life and after conflict. And I'm managing the Colombia work. We have a few different case studies, Nigeria, Colombia, and soon Iraq, and Nigeria, and Niger and Chad as well. And I'm managing the Colombia work within that. And for our project, for our Colombia work, we're looking at really trying to look at the diversity of experiences, roles, and perspectives that women, particularly women who are leaving armed groups, have had in Colombia. And one thing that really really strikes me still, both in the work that we're doing, but also more broadly, I think in the kind of WPS world, is that women are often still seen as victims before anything else. As Dr. Enloe said, I think there's such a diversity of experiences that women have, and we I think still need to drive home the point that we need to look beyond the kind of victim identity to understand and support the full kind of equal and meaningful participation of women in all aspects of security and political processes. A couple of things that I think are particularly interesting on this point are just we have a report coming out next week, and we found that women were more fearful of ex-combatants. Women community members were more fearful of ex-combatants coming back to their communities than men. And thinking through kind of what their experiences might have been in conflict, and particularly the fact that we collected this data in conflict-affected communities with high numbers of victims. We did first look at whether or not victimization would explain this difference, and it didn't, which I think kind of goes again to the point that we need to keep analyzing the data, and that's what we're doing at the moment, keeping on analyzing the data to understand what else there might be that makes women more at least the women respondents in our sample more fearful of ex-combatants than men, and how we can address that, because it obviously has implications for reconciliation and other processes. Other things that we're looking at, the double stigma of women ex-combatants who have broken with traditional gender roles by taking up arms, but are also ex-combatants, and now kind of they're coming back to civilian life. Many of them report feeling an expectation that they're going to fall back into traditional gender roles, including from partners who they male romantic partners who they were in armed groups with, now want them to kind of transition back to more traditional gender roles, and how they kind of manage and navigate that. And then another point, which I was reminded of when I saw the event title about how to stay curious. This for me was a new kind of issue. Women who are joining armed groups because they're not finding justice for gender-based violence in their communities, and so they see the armed groups as a way of getting revenge and getting justice for the gender-based violence that they're experiencing. So I guess getting to my question, I think in addressing these challenges, we often place the burden of change on the women affected by the challenges. How can we help them to overcome their fear? How can we help them to navigate the social dynamics of stigma against them? And I think that's all quite sort of short-sighted. And what we should be looking at, obviously, and I think there are initiatives that do this, but I think much more we need initiatives that look at how we can change the structures that are causing these challenges. And so I guess the question I had for the panelists was, where should we be focusing our efforts to change these structures so that these challenges and barriers are lifted? And perhaps particularly to Dr. Enloe, where should researchers focus their efforts in order to contribute to structural change on these issues? Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that's a pretty direct question. So I think maybe we'll go right to the panel. I mean, where it's a good, vital question. Really, where should we focus our efforts? What are the priorities? And we'll start right back with you, Cynthia, and then Don's got his hand up. But also I'll give the opportunity to any of the panelists to respond. Cynthia, you're on mute. Amanda,
let me just say at the beginning, I want to hear what Lausanne and Elaine say to that question.
Okay.
That's who I really want to hear from. I think this is not, I mean, the research you're doing, Crystal, and other people are doing as well, goes back to at least the war in Zimbabwe. I can remember studies, this is back in the 1970s, early 80s, finding that women in their role as mothers of sons, women wear many hats, and every single hat, right, I can see Elaine nodding, every single hat a woman wears, if she's a street market vendor, if she's a mother of sons, if she is herself a wife, every single one is distorted by the experiences of armed conflict and trying to get through it and create some kind of genuine security, not militarized security, after the most blatant forms of collective violence, which is not to say post-war, really. And one of the things I remember, this was when I was just beginning to really ask feminist questions about how wars are waged and how, well, tentative, uncertain, fragile, short-handed forms of peace are being created. And I remember it was a study of in Zimbabwe, some of it done by nuns, actually. It was very interesting because they were trying to set up educational programs for young teenage girls who were coming out of Zapo and ZANU as ex-combatants. And what they found was that the girls told them was, no mother of sons wants us to be her daughter-in-law, because we are now tainted with having been in male-dominated groups for years, not to mention that we've lost out on years of schooling. And so that women in their roles as mothers of sons are amongst the people who are shaping the notion of who is a respectable, marriageable girl. And that shapes post-war for the girls, for the sons, for those mothers. And that is so gritty and granular, right? But it is real life, right? As Crystal, I'm sure, is finding in her research. I was just in Iceland doing a week's seminar with 20 wonderful gender specialists from the global South, 1 man and 19 women, fabulous, from Malawi and Kenya and Mexico. They were just great. And one of the Nepalese women, there were 2 Nepalese women, one of the Nepalese women, now this is, so I started thinking about mothers of sons in post-war and what they think is a proper girl to marry their precious sons. And here was a Nepalese young gender analyst who was saying, oh, well, that's exactly what's happening in post-war Nepal, is that, you know, a woman who is the mother of a son has a lot of responsibilities, and they are for future family security. And she said, in Nepal right now, there is a suspicion that any woman who was with any of the insurgent or the government's military has been tainted. So for me, but really, I want to hear what Lausanne and Elaine have found. For me, the first thing is go granular. Don't think that a woman who has many roles and one of them is being a mother of sons, don't imagine that she's not interesting. She is interesting, and we all better listen to her. Secondly, we can only do that if we support women's groups on the ground. That is local women's groups, oftentimes who don't have fancy acronyms, who don't have big budgets, they don't have, you know, computer access. They are doing the hard work of changing people's attitudes towards ex-combatants, but also towards women's new sense of insecurity in post-war. Pay attention, devote serious attention to local women's groups. I mean, Crystal wasn't implying this, but you don't parachute in as if we us types have the answers. We do research. Usually we should do it in partnership. And secondly, we better really learn from local women's groups.
Great. Thank you. I think, I mean, so everything that you say really, I think everybody who knows your work knows this, but the fundamental sort of directives of your work, where are the women, ask these questions and stay curious, thread through everything that you're saying, which is really fascinating to me, is that we have to really push ourselves to keep asking those questions, and be conscious to the doors that they open to be able to effect those paradigm shifts that that Elaine was discussing. I could just let you keep talking. You though said, well, Don took his hand down. You said you wanted to hear from Lausanne and Elaine. So why don't we do that? Don, you mind? We'll go to Lausanne first, and then Elaine, and then we'll come back to you, Don. Great.
Thank you, Professor Cynthia. I wish I had long years of experience in the research arena, but unfortunately, no. I can speak only from my own experience. I'm from Rwanda. I think the focus to respond to Crystal in the research should be, how do we shift the mindset of a male-dominated organization? How do we shift that mindset and tailor it to every continent, every nation, every culture, every background? How do we shift that mindset? How do we start with an education framework from the beginning in the family and make the future son of tomorrow or girls of tomorrow think in a binary way? Think, I'm putting myself in the shoe of a man, I'm putting myself in the shoe of a woman. How do we make that distinction? How do we, from a young boy, from my young 8 years boy, how do I make sure that in the future he thinks that he's not only the center of attention, he's not only the man, the power? How do I make sure that I put that in him? So that shifting of mindset is really something that we should focus with practical ways of doing it. Practical and less policy, less guidance. I'm sitting also in the policy and doctrine team in the Office of Military Affairs. We are writing a lot of doctrines and SOPs, but sometimes really, really difficult to translate in practical work, practical shifting of doctrine, of mindset, of anything in any domain. So how to do it practically, it's a challenge. It's been now less than 20 years that I'm in the army, in the Rwanda Defense Forces. I don't know what was the statistic prior to the genocide against the Tutsi in my country, but I can say that the percentage of women in the police, military, and correctional, I can confidently say that we were less than 1% or even 2%. But after the genocide, you started to see that increase. It was a slow increment, but you see that increases. And the reason number one that all those women who are joining the military and the police say that I joined the army or the police because I've seen what happened in my country. That's why I wanted to join. But it's unfortunate to see that you need to go through something, a genocide in my case, so that you have the click in the mind of people, or in the mind of mostly the women, in joining the military or the police or the correctional. Again, I don't have a long background in the academic world, but those are my thinking. Finding practical ways of making sure that people are shifting their mindset.
Great. Thank you so much. Elaine?
Thank you. I will share with you my own personal experience in the Central American region, and I will get back to you with some questions myself, because we know that the Central American region is a success story, or has been a success story in terms of peace negotiations. And we have a regional peace agreement that helped end the civil wars and establish a whole new regional paradigm that demilitarized societies. Somewhat, I mean, the agreements implied democratization, demilitarization. So there was a decrease in military expenditure and the size of the militaries and the role of the militaries, and they went under civilian control. Okay. Then the demobilization of the previous guerrilla and military personnel, and basically it was a political settlement. There was supposed to be the agreements in each country were supposed to be complemented with socioeconomic reforms to deal with development and the original causes that trigger the conflict. There were pretty much social injustice plus authoritarian rule. So at the beginning of the century, I was the first woman being appointed as Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, and in that capacity, I had to preside over the Central American Commission on Security, which was actually a body that was created after the peace agreements to follow up and create a cooperative democratic security arrangement and cooperation mechanism in the region. This is very interesting because being from Costa Rica, you know, we have a different view of security. So I never thought about this experience until yesterday when I was thinking about this panel. Because I was a young woman, and Costa Rica did not attend those meetings. And precisely because of the rejection of the military, of sitting down with the military. And I decided to promote yet a different approach, but I had to request permission and convince both the minister and through the minister, my head of state, to allow me in Costa Rica to sit at that table with the military people. And the reason why I explained to them is that we needed to talk to them to be able to promote the civilian and democratic approach to security. And I am very surprised that they gave me the green light. Now that I look back, I am really surprised that happened. So I started to go to the meetings. I ended up presiding over the committee, and there were military and security officials together with foreign affairs officials. So I have to say that at the beginning, they looked at me with terrible mistrust. And I looked at them with terrible mistrust. Being from Costa Rica, I kind of rejected the men in uniform. Well, that was something that is, of course, is very entrenched in our DNA as Costa Ricans. But you know what happened? After several sessions, we came to discover what was common to all of us, which was our common humanity. And I realized that they did to the soldiers. They were people, they were persons. They did suffer the war. They lost brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers. And there is a gap between that who is soldier and that who makes the policy. And they were very, I have to say, there was a lot of pain because they acknowledged that in the case of Central America, we put the bodies and other people put the weapons. And this, so at the end, we realized that we did not want to see the Central American region fall back to war. And so we were able to establish a connection, and on that basis to continue on working, because, and this is when I say there is this cross-sectionality, not, I mean, the analytical tool is not only the feminist approach or the women peace and security, but also there are other aspects, North-South, Cold War, geopolitical competition, and then just the human approach. The soldiers are, the male soldiers, they're men, and they were also afraid of dying, and they said to me, we put the bodies. So this is to explain that there is a lot, as Cynthia was mentioning, there are a lot of variables that we have to put together. Then at some point I went and lived in El Salvador for work reasons, and I had a friend who had been a guerrilla woman. She had been in the mountains, she had the rifle, everything. And she was not there because of the violence that she experienced as a woman, but because of the social injustice that she saw in her society. So we have to combine different, there is cross-sectoral and cross-sectionality overall. So I would like to say, just to finish with this is, I would like to ask those people in academia and think tanks, help us, because Central America now has fallen into a completely different type of violence. We went from political to criminal violence, but the societies are being torn, and this is why part of why we are seeing people fleeing to North America, to the US. I would like to understand what went wrong. What went wrong in our region? Part of what I think needs to be further studied is what happened with the excess of weapons and small arms, and what happened with the demobilization of the military effectives, and with the integration process into civilian life. Something went wrong there. Something went wrong. And it will be very important to be able to understand this success story that later degenerated.
Thank you so much for that, the deep experience in your region. There's so much, and we talked about the specific cases of disarmament, we talked about peacekeeping and such, but this point about a peace processes is really fundamentally important. And I think the issue that you raise about cross-sectionality is really at the heart of it. Cynthia and others have, and Elaine mentioned this function of bringing in the broader issues, and as I'm sure you all know, IPI and others have engaged in research that demonstrates that one of the benefits of broadening out gender equality in peace negotiations is that it is these broader issues that get brought to the table. And so you're not just having a negotiation between men with guns negotiating about power, you're actually talking about society and what is required in order to sustain the peace that is being negotiated. So that's a really important point, and your experience is so valuable on that. Don, we've gotten far away from the original question that was posed, but please, we would really like to hear your insights.
Well, thank you, and I'm going to
respond to anything if you like. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go into a story as well of my aha moment, which happened some 25 years ago. I was Bill Clinton's advisor for Africa, and one of the things that I was involved with in 1994 was negotiation of the peace process in Angola. As you know, it was a 25-year civil war that had cost 500,000 lives, left 3 million people homeless, 1 million landmines planted in the ground, and it had even survived the Cold War, which was its root in many ways. And so we reached an agreement in late 1994, and I asked President Clinton to name me ambassador to Angola so I could go out and help implement the agreement. And I remember at my press conference as I was going out, the final question that was asked was, how does this agreement impact women? It was probably the first time I had thought about that question, having worked for a year and a half on the agreement. And I said quite proudly, there isn't a single provision of this agreement that is discriminatory against women. I then went out to Angola and joined the Peace Commission. And it took me about 3 weeks to realize that that was the stupidest comment I have ever made. The agreement, by definition, excluded women's participation, and therefore it was discriminatory against women per se. And let me go through just a few of the problems that we faced. The first thing we did at the beginning of the agreement was pass 13 separate amnesties. We forgave men with guns for giving other men with guns for crimes committed against women. We even had one provision that said you can commit any crime you want for the next 6 months and we'll forgive that too. And so it was like a get out of jail free card. And what that said immediately was that rule of law wasn't important in our process, that women's suffering and their validating their suffering and having joint commissions address past crimes was not anywhere in the cards. And it said to women, this isn't your peace process. This is the peace process for the men with the guns. We then put together the Joint Commission, 40 members, the United States, Russia, Portugal, the rebel UNITA, the UN, and the government. 40 representatives and not a single woman at the table. I remember at one point someone asking me about that right when I got there, and I said, well, that's okay, I'll represent the women. And I have been ridiculed for that comment ever since, justifiably so. Because of the absence of women, we didn't address issues that you've all talked about here today, accountability for past violence, psychosocial support for the victims of and survivors of crimes during the war, girls' education, mother-child health care issues. They weren't even on the agenda, and yet they were the root causes of the poverty that had led to the conflict for so many years. When we began to demobilize soldiers, we said, all you got to do is hand over a gun and you get all these fine support mechanisms. Well, in many cases, women didn't have guns. In most cases, women were messengers or bearers or even sex slaves. And so they were outside of the camps. And outside of the camps, there were 20,000 women who were subjected to sexual violence, not only just being there, but especially when they went out to get wood or other things for the men in the camp. I'm intrigued, Crystal, by your comment regarding the fear in the villages, because we didn't even pay attention to that issue. We just asked the men, where do you want to be returned to? And we gave them a little bit of money, some seeds, some tools, and we sent them back. But what we hadn't realized is that they had no place in those societies. The war had gone on for so long that the women had stepped forward to play the dominant role in society. And so the men came back, they were frustrated, they were angry, they felt disempowered, and we saw a rash of sexual violence, domestic abuse, femicide, that was just dominant all throughout. It was as if the end of the formal conflict had leashed a new and more pernicious form of violence on those women. We even had problems with clearing landmines, because what we did was we cleared the landmines on the roads so that the 3 million people could get back to their villages. What we didn't know, because we hadn't asked the women, because they weren't at the table, was that in the villages themselves, there were landmines planted in the fields, in the schools, at the water supplies. We had a rash, and up to 25,000 women blow off either a part of their body or die because the men sent them out to collect firewood or to plant the fields or to open the schools. The bottom line is that an agreement that calls itself gender neutral is gender stupid. And we tried desperately to keep the peace process going, even when the rebels decided to pull out. And at that point, we went to women in the society and we said, can't you put pressure on the two warring parties to resolve this? And they looked at us as if we were from the moon. They said, you disempowered us right at the beginning of this process. And now, and you structured a process that had no interest for us. And now you're asking us to put pressure on the parties? We can't do that. The country went back to civil war. We lost another 100,000 people. And the war only ended when the rebel leader was killed about 4 years later. So, Adam, the short answer to your question is bring women to the table, listen to them, bring intersectional women who have, indigenous population identities or disabilities or LGBT or people who are displaced. And don't just bring them to the table for appearance sake, but listen to them, bring them to the head of the table. I am absolutely shocked that we haven't learned this lesson in 25 years, despite the work that so many people have done in this space. You just look at Afghanistan and it was obvious. I mean, it was obvious, as I said, Adam, 2 years ago, when I think you yourself said, we're setting the Afghan country up for failure by involving, no women, no civil society in the negotiation process and building a false peace on the backs of the progress that women have accomplished. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, thank you, Don. The Angola case study is such an extraordinary case study, and your personal experiences are so insightful. And I'm just reeling from this example of the landmine. It's so basic and such a stark example of what can happen when you don't bring the broader society to the table and ask these questions and stay curious, and not just bring them there, but as you say, put them at the head of the table, let them work with them to construct the agenda that will have a broader impact. Otherwise, you are setting it up for failure, as we see again and again.
Adam, could I just interrupt for a second?
Please do.
And just underscore what everybody has just said here, because it's so, women are excluded from the serious negotiations and the implementation because they are not seen as knowledgeable. And that's because, I can see Elaine nodding her head. That's because we don't know what knowledge is. We have in whatever stratospheric areas we all work in, we have such a naive notion of knowledge. You want to know where guns are? Ask women. They'll tell you exactly where the guns are in every household. They're afraid of them. They don't control them, but they know where they are. As Ron said, want to know where the landmines are? Ask rural women. But to assume that women are not knowledgeable, maybe they have intuition, maybe they have important domestic roles. Okay, we'll ask them way down the road about that. But what if you thought women actually have the kind of knowledge that will make us, all of us, smarter about what security actually looks like and how it operates and how insecurity operates? Treat, not all women are knowledgeable, but if you don't ask a lot of diverse women, we will all stay, as Ron put it, ignorant and stupid. And that is very risky.
Can I just give one more example of that? We had a commission that was looking into existing and future ceasefire violations. And we kept asking the commanders of the forces, for their information, as if they were going to tell us where they were going to next violate the ceasefire. After a few months, we finally decided to go into the marketplaces and ask the women traders in the marketplace, because they needed to know when they were going to have to get back on the road again as a displaced person because a ceasefire violation was about to occur. And they knew the answer and they were prepared to share it with us. But for months and months, we just kept asking the military commanders as if they were, the experts in this space. Again, Cynthia is entirely right. Grassroots knowledge in those settings is far more important than the rank on your uniform.
Thank you. So I think that this point of women are not seen as knowledgeable is an important one. And I think it's important for us to remember we've got some incredible knowledge here on this panel. I think earlier said, Cynthia, researchers should go granular. And so I'd like to shift a bit the conversation, get specific on a couple of points. We have a question here in the chat from Harnett Segi, who's a former gender advisor at the UN. And she has a specific question. She says to it's all panelists, but I think it's really particularly addressed to Lassane about this point that you had made about the we still have a problem with boots on the ground, female uniformed peacekeepers. There's low, and there's even fewer, she says, and not much at higher rank and position. She's asking specifically, why is that? She says there were several recommendations made by researchers on the matter and by those who worked on the air at the UN system. Among them, the recommendations are using quota systems in recruiting personnel and working with national governments to introduce mechanisms to reduce family responsibility that prevent uniformed women to from leaving their kids and family without someone to take care of them. Has there been any progress on the implementation of some of these recommendations? What specific policies can be done to increase the participation of of uniformed women in peacekeeping operations, and national armies as well, which I think is combined. Lassane, could you share with us some specifics on that?
Yeah, yes, I mean, first of all, I would like to thank Arnett because not only she's the first OMA gender advisor. Basically, she set up the ground for all of us who came after her. Yeah, I know.
So she's testing you.
Yeah. So to her first question, yes, the number of women uniform peacekeeper is still low. And then her question is focusing on high rank and position. We all need to understand that to have a higher rank in the police or the military, you have to grow, build capacity, train and experience a soldier from year 1 to year 20 or 30 or 40 so that you have that high ranking. So it takes years to have that high ranking. When we see all the major TCC actually in the ground, we can ask ourselves, since when women started joining their respective armies and police? I should say recently. I can say the resolution 1325 might have been the trigger for most of those nations to start recruiting more, promoting more, and getting those high-ranking level women at those high-ranking positions. So it takes a while. Yes, we do have brigadier generals and major generals from other nations who are not major TCC, but again, the question comes back to member states. Where are those women generals? Where are those women brigadier generals and major general who can be deployed as force commander, deputy force commander, and on and on? The police is doing quite well. I think they have so far 6 or 7 women at the leadership position in all peacekeeping missions combined. The military, we do have only 3 women combined force commander and deputy force commander, which is, again, it's low because it takes time to grow a high-ranking personnel. But yeah, it's a problem. It's a structural problem that member states need to address. You know, recruit those women, train them, build their capacity, and then promote them, and then have a pool for deployment. To her other question, yeah, about the recommendation. Yes, the United Nations, no, the Uniform Gender Parity Strategy, approved and disseminated by the DPO in 2018, addresses all those recommendations. So among them, for example, now a woman is allowed to be deployed for 6 months when she has a child of 7 years old or less. So there is those opportunities. This is one example. So some of those recommendations are also in the UGPS, in the Uniform Gender Parity Strategy. Yes, the implementation and of those recommended items, yes, it's been practically, I would say, used with the fourth generation service in the Office of Military Affairs. They're basically, I mean, when a member state approach us and saying that we do have suitable candidates, they are women, but they have small kids, is it possible to deploy them for 6 months, 4 months? It's something that we look into it, and we have those opportunities also for those deployments. Her last question, in order to increase the participation, national should recruit more women. Yes, yes. What can I say? Yes, yes. Member states, you should increase women participation in national army and in the future in peace operation. And yeah, it's an advocacy. It's a call that we've been doing, and you also, Arnett, you've been doing while in the Office of Military Affairs. But yes, yes. I don't know if that addresses.
No, absolutely. I have sort of another question that came through that could be seen as a bit of a follow-up. Unless, does someone else want to answer any of these specific points? Another question in the chat. I'll read it, but raises this issue of stereotyping of what women can do when they are appointed and such. And Cynthia, you said that women are excluded because they're not seen as knowledgeable, but they're also excluded or put in a box because they're seen as only knowledgeable within a specific specialized place. And one of our researchers sent me an article about that coined the term side streaming. That we talk about mainstreaming of gender issues, but what you're also experiencing is this sort of side streaming. You're bringing women into the security system, but you're putting them into these specialized areas and such, and counting that as increasing women's participation. So how could you work against this kind of stereotyping and this what is ultimately this kind of side streaming phenomenon? And have you seen it in your work and experience?
Yes, I did see that. I did see that in my experience and in my work, even in my background, personal background. But how to address that? It's a challenge. using my voice and my experiences, basically saying that whatever my counterpart male is doing, I'm able also to do it. But also you have, again, I mentioned that during my opening note, that you have structural issue with member states based on the cultural background and mindset that, oh, those women, they are only able to do such type of job. We cannot put them in the front line. You have, for example, some member states that say openly that they cannot deploy in MINUSMA in Mali because Mali is very dangerous and they don't want to put the women at risk. That's why they deploy them in kind of soft missions. So that's why you see the statistics for some mission they call soft missions very high, and missions who are really in need and in call for more women, such as Central African Republic and Mali. You have a very, very low percentage of women deployed. So again, it's a structural and mindset shift that need to happen within member states. And what we are doing and what I'm doing is basically advocating and saying and showing by my own example that what my counterpart do, I can basically do it. It's a shift that need to happen based on examples and advocacy and raising the voice that the mind need to shift. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Cynthia, did you want to come in?
Well, I just want to give a shout out to a recent study by UNIDIR done by Hannah and Emma and their team at UNIDR. And it's gender in women, ammunition, and women weapons, ammunition, and management. WAM, I guess it's called by the Inside Baseball folks. And it's a brand new, I think it's 2021. And everybody should read it as a way of watching how sexism and the exclusion of women and the privileging of certain kinds of men in disarmament works. And one of the things that really I learned so much from studying, from reading carefully, slowly, with pen in hand, Emma and Hannah's and the team's report by UNIDIR. And that is that it's considered, that is weapons management is considered something that only people with a military background can be trained in. So that's the militarization of disarmament. It also turns out to be the masculinization of the militarization of disarmament. If you imagine you're running a disarmament program, a weapons and ammunition management program, storage, safety, and you imagine that those techniques can only be learned by people who've had military training and are masculinized in the kind of knowledge they're comfortable with, that is, can be trained in, you will end up with what you now have in most countries, a masculinized WAM program. That is the masculinization, the militarization of disarmament. And the other thing that the report really taught me is you've got to pay attention. This Lausanne was so good about this. You have to pay attention to the pipeline. That is, who gets trained in the things that are used as the criteria for being selected to be a trainee in weapons and ammunition management. And so the pipeline really has to be paid attention to, not the final outcome. The third thing that I learned from this UNIDIR report on gender and WAM is that it's considered high tech, which usually privileges men wrongly. But the second thing is it's very high tech, and it is so low tech in the way it is distorted, because it's all about gender stereotypes, which is about as low tech as you can get. You know, kids in the playground know how to do gender stereotyping. Well, it turns out the people who run WAM training programs are back in the playground with what boys can do and what girls can do. It's a wonderful report. It's a real wake-up call. So I learned a lot about what Lausanne was talking about which is about the pipeline, about the training, and about the insidious continuation of the most low-tech stereotypes.
Right.
It's a great report.
Don, yeah.
Yeah, in addition to the security sector itself, I really believe that this is a requirement for the academic community to redefine what national security and international security looks like. If you think about the biggest challenges we're facing right now, even the US Defense Intelligence Agency prioritizes climate change, prioritizes COVID response, prioritizes closing civil society space and authoritarianism in countries at least at the level of China. And, you know, whether you believe China is a national security threat or not, that's a completely separate question. But until we redefine what national security looks like, it will take a long, long time for us to demasculize the hard security questions. Because frankly, as I said at the beginning, the gatekeepers at present are all men. And they're the ones who make the decision as to who, you know, becomes the SRSG in a country. And they're the ones who make the decision who becomes the Assistant Secretary of Defense in countries. And, you know, those very few of those people are going to be listening to conversations like we're having right now.
Yeah, Don, that's a good, can I just jump in, because this is a good segue to my final question, to also set up your final remarks. It connects with one of the questions in the chat, and also back to Elaine's point earlier on about impact and moving forward in the next generation. You know, and how do you change those people ultimately in the next generation who's in the room with the gatekeepers and such. And so the question, and I think basically what I'd like to do is sort of go back, and I'll go right back to you, Don, so you can finish your thought and also wrap, sort of have your final remarks, and then we'll go in reverse order on the panel to Elaine, and then Lassana, and then Cynthia, you close. Question is, how do you do that? How do you change in a generation those gatekeepers to have that impact, to move to the move forward? And what in your experience, did you experience personally a mentor? What in your experience opened that door for you? You know, should we be talking about special scholarships? Should we be talking about just mentor relationships? What in your experience did that, and how can we as a community and as individuals make that commitment to really make it happen, so that in the next generation is different? And so we'll go back to you, Don, and then we'll go on the panel forward to make any final remarks that you like, and then on to Cecile for closing remarks. Don, back to you.
So just really quickly, this is what we're trying to do with the Mobilizing Men as Partners for Women, Peace, and Security. Just to quickly summarize, we have some 250 individuals and institutions who are committed to the role of women in peace processes and international security issues. These are former generals, these are former ambassadors, some heads of state, some foreign ministers who get it, who understand this important point. And they are reaching out to colleagues who are currently serving, saying, you really should talk to these women when they come to Washington or Brussels or New York. And we open doors, but we don't speak for them. They speak for themselves. We also are supporting grassroots women peace builders through grants we provide that are completely unrestricted. They decide how they need to use the resources. In many cases, they use the resources to free women peace activists from their day jobs. And so they are free to be full-time advocates. And I think Lima Gaboe is probably the best example of that, when she finally had the money to be able to quit her day job and promote peace in West Africa. We also serve as watchdogs. So we look at 1325. We look at all the subsequent Security Council resolutions. We look at the national action plans that countries have developed under 1325. We look, in the case of the United States, are we really implementing the 2017 Women, Peace and Security Act that was passed? And in most cases, looking at a shaking head right now, the answer is no. And we have to hold people accountable for those provisions. Fortunately, this group that we're involved with is flourishing. They have great contacts with current senior officials who are, again, mostly men. And they represent not just Western countries, but all countries around the world. And
Great.
so I think this effort at the sort of, and I hate to say this, but I will, at the elite level is one approach that we're adopting. Obviously, other people will be able to talk more about how you actually reach out to a new generation of leaders and how you educate people in the issues that we're dealing with.
Great. Great. Thanks, John. Elaine, any final remarks and response to this question that you raised, and also your personal experience, perhaps? I think you're okay. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. Let's see. I usually think about connecting the dots, and there are two instruments I think that are worth exploring, but one of them, since I'm not an expert in the elections of the Security Council, but in the human rights field, we have a process that is a voluntary process by which countries that want to be elected there are candidates for election to membership of the Human Rights Council, can take up voluntary pledges. And actually this is something that is voluntary, but it's already like a norm. It's not well seen that you don't do like a town hall meeting where you have delegates from other countries asking you what your pledges are and any other questions. So I think something that could be interesting from this part of civil society and think tanks would be to explore whether these kind of pledges can be adopted also for, even if it's for the E10, right, for the elected members, to have some sort of pledges so that we somewhat compel or challenge or encourage countries that are going to sit at the Security Council to generate a doctrinal approach to women, peace, and security. That is, I think, a possibility that I would like to. I am not, as I said, an expert in the elections of the Security Council, so I don't know if such things already exist. The other thing I have seen with much interest is what room there is in our common agenda proposal to further this women, peace, and security agenda. This proposal by the Secretary General, which is pretty interesting. It has very interesting stuff. I see two things there. One is several things I see. One is the issue of anticipation and foresight. I find it very interesting that this common agenda is based also on a look forward on a foresight dialogue. And I think it will be interesting for think tanks and women experts to see if there is a possibility to do a little bit of foresight and anticipation as to what the new challenges for women, peace, and security are for the upcoming and emerging threats and sources of conflict and weaponry systems, you know, drones, targeted attacks, lethal autonomous weapon systems, and what have you. That is like one part. Emerging technologies and disruptive technologies, how they're changing the new systems of war, and seeing how this is going to affect women in the future. The other aspect I think that needs to be incorporated in the analysis, the issue of how climate-related future conflicts are going to affect women, because the first thing that is going to apply is a more fierce competition on the available resources. So where we see the challenges and how we can complement with the first generation of women, peace, and security, the 4 pillars of that agenda. And I was reading a, I'm sorry, I forgot. I know it was not Cynthia, I'm absolutely sure. A piece by an expert also mentioning that the promotion of participation of women in the decision-making process. I have to finish? Yes. The need to have, besides the delegates, to have consultations with experts, because the delegates, as I said, we cannot put on their shoulders just to put all on in the decision-making process the women perspective, because they don't have a mandate to do so. So to see how we can explore processes of consultation with experts and civil society organizations that can actually better inform in the decision-making process the women perspective. I will leave it.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, there's obviously so much to talk about. I mean, I thought that this question and answer as an hour long was maybe going to be too long. We could talk for 2 more hours, but we have only a few more minutes left, and I do want to give Lassane and Cynthia a chance to give any final comments. Lassane, please.
Thank you. I do have 2 calls. To your question here, where are the women? Women are there. They are half of the population in the world. Give them opportunity to voice their concern, their needs, their views, their ideas, but they should also take those opportunities and not wait to be given those opportunities. So it's 2 calls. So 1 call to us and 1 call to whoever is giving the opportunity. And based on what Dr. Cynthia mentioned earlier about knowledge, if you think they don't have the knowledge, give them that knowledge. Give them the knowledge that you want for them. And again, all of this without fear of reprisal, because I think a lot of women don't speak up. We all have a lot to say, but we don't speak up because of fear of reprisal. That is something that is very crucial, and we need to be able to speak up without fear of anything. Another last point that I would like to request the academia here is how working on how to make sure that all the qualitative and quantitative research that you are doing in the WPS arena is translated in practical policies at the national level, and it's considered and considered seriously by member states. That is my last point.
Thank you so much. Cynthia, please wrap up for the panel, and then we'll move to Cecile for closing remarks. You're on mute. So you're on mute, Cynthia. We can't hear you.
So the first thing is, I've been taking notes because this is such a smart group of people. So the first thing is re-listen to this whole session, everybody out there, and take your own notes and then do something. The second thing is just to underscore that you have to listen to all kinds of women in all kinds of settings, or you will not ever get sustainable peace. And if you don't get sustainable peace, you will never achieve, we, all of us will never achieve genuine security. And the last thing I'd say to all the attendees out there, try, this is an experiment, keep a log, try in the next 2 weeks, well, be ambitious, go through November. And every time you're in an informal or formal, don't forget the pub, the informal or formal conversation, and somebody casually says national security or security affairs, as if they know that you assume it's a militarized version of security, watch yourself and see if you can break into the conversation. And keep your log to say when you didn't. And what about your fears of career made you stay silent when you should have said, that's not real security? And then tell me what you find.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. We will keep you informed. And now we will turn to Cecile Abtel, Unidir partner. Thank you so much for partnering with us on this event. You have closing remarks, please, Cecile.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adam. When 30 years ago, Professor Enlow, you asked, where are the women? That was a rhetorical question, but forcefully highlighting the many different ways gender, conflict, security, and power interrelate. 30 years later, that question remains very vivid, as we saw today. The fact that the relevance of this question has barely diminished is in fact concerning. It is concerning first and foremost because there are still too many meetings, too many fora, too many influential circles where women are underrepresented. Today, unfortunately, we still cannot take women's participation for granted. There is a growing number of calls for the full and equal participation of women in security, but our attention should be on turning these calls into reality, moving from words to deeds. Sustained attention continues to be needed to women's underrepresentation and ensuring that women's experiences are considered in all international security realms. Importantly, we need spaces created and cultivated to continue demanding for that full and equal participation of women in international security and to effectively support such participation. This means recognizing, confronting, and overcoming the structural gender inequalities in all areas of international security, including in arms control and disarmament, mediation, and peacekeeping. It also requires us going beyond gendered identities that construe all women as victims or all women as standing for peace, and conversely, associate all men with violent masculinity. And doing that without ignoring the specific suffering and particular perspectives of women and of girls. We didn't mention girls often, but young women are also really have specific perspectives to bring. Events like this one play a very important part on this journey and in shifting the paradigm, to paraphrase Ambassador White Gomez. In this regard, I would like to thank her and really all of our wonderful panelists today for joining us, and of course IPI for the collaboration on this joint event, with particular thanks to Adam Ruppel. Today's event has fulfilled, I think, its promise to discuss the many different roles of women, the diversity of their perspectives, how policies and practices can advance meaningfully and meaningful inclusivity and in a meaningful way. We heard of different initiatives seeking to create and support programs and policy to break the pattern of exclusion in international security. We've heard, in fact, notably from Lausanne, Nsengimana in Bahrain, how the UN is seeking to transform its organizational culture. And thank you very much for reminding us that this all starts with practical ways to shift mindsets, and that ultimately we need structural changes. The Women, Peace and Security agenda, now entering its third decade, has been a driving force for inclusion, but we need to really do more. Slowly but surely, the participation of women has increased, and thank you, Ambassador White-Gomez, for reiterating it. This may generate a reinterpretation, or may need to generate a reinterpretation of what international security actually means. This poses the important questions of critical security approaches and also of feminist perspectives on international security. We need to redefine what international security and international insecurity mean. As Cynthia indicated, we may even need to question our definition and understanding of knowledge. Ambassador Steinberg, thank you for reminding us also of the importance of questioning whether we are walking the talk in our own respective sphere of influence, and the need to guard against tokenism. We at UNIDIR are very proud to walk the talk and champion diversity in international security and disarmament. We have been engaging with women and men from different regions to uncover specific barriers and opportunities as well, that exist as well in the different parts of the world, and will continue to do so. As part of this effort, we will next week be hosting a discussion with UN Women considering the role of women in international security in the Middle East, and we hope that many of you will join us for this event on the 27th of October. As we continue to work towards gender equality in international security and disarmament, we're very grateful to our partners. So please allow me to thank the cross-regional co-sponsors of this event, the governments of Canada, Costa Rica, Ireland, Namibia, Norway, the Philippines, and Sweden. This is an encouraging example of cross-regional collaboration towards the integration of gender perspective into international security matters. So finally, I'd like to thank again each of you, and each also of you in the public for joining us today. Adam, back to you.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much. Really, it's been such a tremendous honor to listen and learn from all of you. And all that I can say is just thank you again. Thank you to the partners. Thank you to the co-sponsors, to all our panelists, and to everyone that stuck with us to the end, even though we've gone a little bit late. Have a great afternoon, and keep watching. We'll be following. We'll be consistently engaged on this issue moving forward. Thank you again. Take care.